Well, good morning. This spring is off to a rocky start, but the Great Lakes shipping season is underway. What's the outlook for this year? Our guest this morning is someone who can answer that question, and it all starts right now.
From TV6, this is The Ryan Report. Now, here's your host, Don Ryan.
You know, shipping on the Great Lakes has been going on for many years. Some historians trace it back to 1679. For this region, iron ore shipping has been a vital connection for the mining industry dating back to the 1800s. What are the issues and challenges facing the industry today? We're going to talk about that with James Weekly, President of the Lake Carriers Association. Jim, welcome to the Ryan Report.
Thanks, it's great to be here.
Nice to have you. You know, let's give our audience a chance to get to know you a little better first.
Sure.
You're a 1984 graduate of the Coast Guard Academy. What kind of service did you provide in the Coast Guard?
Well, I did, my first 2 years were on a ship out of San Francisco. We patrolled the Alaskan fishing grounds.
Okay.
After that, I went to Philadelphia and did pollution response, and then moved into shipping inspection, worked on the Great Lakes, and ironically, in '89, I served a 6-month apprenticeship in an industry training program for the Lake Carriers Association, and fast forward 20 years now, I run the organization.
Okay, and first you went to work for Interlake Steamship Company?
I did. Interlake Steamship hired me as their personnel director, and then I moved into operations. And after 9/11, I actually got recalled. So I remained in the reserves. I had 10 years active duty, 23 years as a total, 13 years as a reservist.
Okay.
9/11 hit, literally 9/12, I was given a call saying, get your bags packed.
Really?
9/14, I was back on active duty. Stood up what they call the Crisis Action Center in Cleveland. And it was kind of a nice position to be in, because everybody wanted to do something after 9/11, and I was fortunate I could contribute to our
Certainly.
national defense.
Right. So you've really had an interesting background, interesting history to bring to this assignment. Let's talk about the association. It was formed in 1880, I understand. What's the role of the association? Tell our audience what it is. What does it do?
Well, it is one of the oldest trade associations in the United States. Currently, we represent 15 companies and 56 vessels. So the members are actually the vessels, all U.S. flag, American-owned, American-built, American-crewed, primarily sailing on the upper 4 Great Lakes, although they are certified to sail as far as Anacostia Island in the St. Lawrence Seaway. But the majority of our cargoes are on Superior, Michigan, Huron, and Erie. Our largest ships are too big to go into Welland Canal, so 70% of our capacity is limited to the upper 4 Great Lakes.
We think of these ships as being smaller compared to some vessels, but they really aren't. They're large vessels.
Actually, if you stood the Paul Archer Gertha next to the Empire State Building, it would reach the 102nd floor.
Really?
It's the size of an aircraft carrier along the waterline, so 1,014 feet by 105 feet wide by a 56-foot, what we call molded depth.
And these are all cargo-carrying ships. You don't run any passenger ships or cruise ships or any of those things. You're association members.
Correct. Our association, in fact, they're all dry bulk. So we don't even have any tankers in our association anymore. Self-unloading ships, we can unload 10,000 tons of cargo an hour through a series of conveyor belts, and it's really a fascinating industry.
What are some of the changes you've seen since you've been in the business? And certainly that's one of them.
Well, what we've seen is kind of a shift from ships to tug barges. So we've seen more of the tug barge operations come into play. Also, we're seeing some re-enginings. We've seen some replacements of diesel engines with newer, cleaner diesel engines, more efficient vessels. And we're also seeing conversions from our steamships to internal combustion ships as well. So the basic design, the hulls are great. We haven't seen a whole lot of change in the baseline business plan. So what we're seeing is incrementally increasing the efficiency of the business operation.
I may have my timeline wrong, but it seems like, in the 1970s, late 60s, most of the ships were probably 600-700 feet long. Now, the majority are 1,000, maybe not the majority, but many of them are 1,000-footers.
Your memory is exactly correct. So the Poe, lock number 2 at Sault Ste. Marie, was built in 1969. So that was when the 1,000-footers really were allowed to navigate. Before that, the MacArthur or the Maclock was the limiting factor. Okay. Ships are efficient based on their size. So It's a cubic, not a linear increase in efficiency, so the bigger the ship, the more efficient you can carry it.
Okay.
Now there are some advantages of the smaller ships in their ability to get into smaller, more shallow ports and docks that the 1,000-footers can't call on.
Would iron ore and coal be your two largest commodities you carry?
Yes, sir. Iron ore, coal are our bread and butter, and limestone is probably our third. And you know, there's a smattering of cement and sand and some smaller cargoes. But
And you
really,
even carry some grain too, I guess?
we
some of the
do.
ships?
Not as much as we used to, but we do have some
Okay.
grain going from the head of the lakes to Buffalo.
Well, your members have to be concerned about what's happening in the steel and iron ore industries and in the electric energy field. What's your outlook for iron ore? What do you see happening there?
Well, we are concerned. We're a service industry, so we are at the mercy of the industries that we serve. Power, we're concerned about the war on coal. Ontario has gone away from their coal-powered plants. Michigan has several scheduled to close this year and in future years. So that's going to be a challenge. How do we replace that cargo? Iron ore, we're still feeling the effects of steel dumping. We hope that the tariffs will start to take effect, and we'll see our domestic steel rebound.
There's not a lot you can do to drive that horse to change that situation, although I know you have taken strong positions on the impact of steel imports, and the federal government should do something to level the playing field there.
Agreed, and we are an associate member of the American Iron and Steel Institute, so our interests are aligned with our customers, so we do everything that we can to support our customers' interest in that global market.
I know there are a number of specific challenges you're facing. I want to talk about those in just a couple of minutes.
Yes, sir.
We'll do that when we return with more on the Ryan Report in just 2 minutes. Talking with Jim Weekly from the Lake Carriers Association, we talked about the fact that two of their major cargoes are iron ore and coal, and some issues to be dealt with there. But there are some specific things. The Soo locks. A lot of talk about building a new lock to accommodate the larger ships. What's happening? We can't seem to get off ground zero.
Yeah, well, I think we've had a breakthrough. So the Corps did a flawed benefit to cost ratio. And when I say it was flawed, we've been telling them that for 10 years, since 2004 when it came out. They made bad assumptions. The assumption was that if the PO went down, that the railroads could move it at no increased cost. We told them that that's wrong. The rail capacity is not there. The rail connectivity doesn't exist. They effectively ignored us for 10 years. March of 2014, we finally had a more focused meeting with the railroads in the room. The Department of Homeland Security was in the room, and the railroads verified what we've been saying, that if they were required to move that 50 million tons, it would take them 5 years, and it would cost $5 billion to build the capacity.
Yeah, it's amazing.
And shockingly, there were some within the Corps who thought, well, who cares? We can buy steel in the world market. You know, who cares if the American mining industry goes bust, if the American steel industry goes bust? And I was shocked and appalled.
Yeah.
The good news is the Department of Homeland Security just released a report, or I should say the Detroit Free Press just through the Freedom of Information Act, got a copy of the report, and it verifies much of what we've been saying and puts hard numbers. I think the most shocking is that if that PO goes down for 6 months, it puts North America in a recession equal to or greater than the Great Recession we just came out of. 11 million Americans will lose their jobs. 2 to 5 million Canadians and Mexicans will be out of work. Michigan's unemployment statewide goes to 22.6%. And as I recall, in the recession, Michigan was 15% at peak, and the UP was 22%. So picture that cascading effect.
I did see that report, and it is shocking. And it's also shocking that an agency of the government would be so short-sighted not to see the full impact of what would be happening there. Do we think something is going to happen?
So, sometimes the Corps moves at what I refer to as glacial speed. So we fought a year to get a $1.5 million reauthorization that was excess from Corps projects within the Great Lakes. So they're going to spend $1.5 million in 2 years to recalculate their flawed benefit to cost ratio. And what they're struggling with is they've never dealt with a single point of failure where there was not an alternate mode of transportation. So what they did is they assumed that since the cost was zero, and as I explained to them, when you divide by zero, the answer is infinity. So clearly it's between 0 and infinity,
Right.
but it's not 0. So I'm optimistic. I think with the DHS report, they've got some accountability.
I know another issue you're concerned about is ice-breaking capability on the Great Lakes. What's the problem?
Lack of capability. The winter we had 2 years ago, or actually 3 years ago, cost the North American economy about $700 million. So within the Great Lakes, on the U.S. side, we've got one heavy icebreaker, the Mackinac. We really need two Mackinac-capable icebreakers. We've got a series of 140-foot buoy, tugboats that are Coast Guard icebreakers. Very capable boats, but they were built in the 70s. So we've fought hard. We're getting those rehabbed. We've gotten one from the East Coast added here. The Canadians have two icebreakers, but the demand that the Canadian Laker fleet puts on the U.S. fleet far exceeds the two icebreakers that the Canadians bring to the fight. So to the Coast Guard's credit, they managed it as a system. But as I've jokingly said, the Canadian industry and the Canadians' Coast Guard's attitude is what's Canadian, and what's American is actually a shared resource.
Okay.
So we're spread pretty thin, and it's had an impact on our business.
Do you think things are going to change? Are you on the right track?
You know, it's a struggle. The right track is that they're rehabbing the U.S. 140 fleet. The Coast Guard is currently pushing back and claiming that we don't need a second heavy icebreaker. Strangely, at the same time, they're spending $1 billion for one Arctic-class icebreaker. They're reluctant to build $200 million Great Lakes icebreaker. In fact, during the stimulus money, the Mackinac contract was still open. We were on the verge of getting a second Mackinac built under the previous contract, and Congress wasn't willing to do that if the Coast Guard wouldn't support it. And for unexplained reason, as a Coast Guard veteran, I'd say this, the Coast Guard doesn't see the importance of the Great Lakes in our navigation system.
I know another concern of your association is dredging and the fact that many of our channels and shipping lanes are being affected. Tell us about the problem.
So the problem is it's a concept in naval architecture called tons per inch immersion. So for each inch of water, we can load additional cargo, right? On our 1,000-footers, it's 250 tons of cargo for each inch of water. So low water, we were getting creamed by the low water depths in the rivers and the lakes, and then the Corps has a 17 million cubic yard backlog. So if you look at the funding of the Great Lakes Navigation System between 1995 and 2012, it increased 5%. 5% between 95 and 12. That's a net decrease. But there's some good news here. Between 2012 and FY16, the President's budget has increased 40% for the Great Lakes Navigation System. We also, in Water Resources Development Act of 2014, for the first time designated the Great Lakes as a navigation system, recognizing that there's connectivity. So in the past, Detroit would compete with Duluth for funds. We were able to convince Congress and the Corps that Detroit and Duluth are complementary. You need them both to be dredged for the system to work. So I am very optimistic we're making progress.
Do we know how we're doing with the ports here? I know we've been doing dredging in Marquette, and of course Escanaba would be the other major port.
Yeah, so there's some good news. So system-wide, we're getting better funded. We're trying to get a 10% set aside of the Great Lakes, for the Great Lakes of the Harbor Maintenance Trust Fund. So people don't realize that industry as a nation, we pay a 0.0125% tax into the Harbor Maintenance Trust Fund. Nationally, it takes in about $1.2 billion a year. Historically, Congress has spent about $600 million. So since 1986, there's a $9 billion surplus. So we've worked hard from a national perspective to free up that money. And so we're trying to simultaneously expand the size of the pie and make sure we get a bigger slice.
We have only a minute left. Time goes quickly.
Yes, sir.
Safety on the Great Lakes. You know, we don't have a lot of accidents, but when they do happen, they can be tragic. Are we doing well? Are we improving safety for the men and women who work on the ships?
We are. So we just marked the 40th anniversary of the sinking of the Edmund Fitzgerald, the last ship we lost on the Great Lakes. Our ships last a long time because they're a freshwater environment, but they're the most inspected, best maintained, best operated ships in the world, and I think our safety record speaks for itself.
There's just so many more issues we could talk about, but I'm afraid we're out of time. Really appreciate you coming in. This is certainly a vital industry for the Upper Peninsula.
It is, and I always enjoy coming to the UP. I think it's a beautiful place, and there's hard-working people right here in the UP, and I think they set the tone for the rest of the country.
Okay, thanks for being here.
Yes, sir.
I'll be back with more on the Ryan Report after we take this break. A couple of weeks ago, we featured an in-depth interview concerning the iron mining industry with Lourenco Gonçalves, the chairman and CEO of Cliffs Natural Resources. There was another development recently that's important to that discussion. It involves a company called SR Minnesota, a new mining project under construction on the Mesabi Range. In March, that company failed to make a $10 million payment to the state of Minnesota, which was one more indication to many that the project is in serious financial trouble. SR is a global conglomerate headquartered in India with ownership interests in energy, metals, and mining, and other services. One of SR's interests is SR Algoma in Sault Ste. Marie, Ontario. The former Algoma Steel was an original and longtime partner in the Tilden mine. This new facility in Minnesota was hailed as a major development for the Iron Range when ground was broken in 2008. The $1.8 billion project would not only be a mine and plant producing 7 million tons of pellets annually, but a steel mill that could produce steel slabs that could, among other things, be used by the Algoma facility. The plan was to open the new plant in 2011. The project was so highly thought of by the state of Minnesota, they agreed to provide a $66 million grant to pay for some of the infrastructure. But the project was barely underway when it appeared to go off the tracks because of financial and industry issues. Among the early developments was a decision by SR to drop its plans to include steel-making capabilities. That triggered a demand from the state of Minnesota to return the grant because the project did not deliver on the original promises made by the company. This past December 31st, SR agreed to repay the grant, and a timetable was established for repayment that called for a $10 million payment to the state by the end of March. According to state officials, that payment was not received. Speaking to Minnesota Public Radio, Minnesota Governor Mark Dayton said, "They've got even worse in my view. A number of vendors, businesses, small and medium-sized businesses up on the range have not been paid for the services and materials they've provided." The governor added, "In my judgment, they've destroyed the trust they were beginning to establish with people on the range. I'm reviewing what our options are." SR Minnesota said earlier they expected the plant would open sometime this year, but that seems highly unlikely. Many, including the Cliffs CEO, question the need for adding new iron ore capacity. In our conversation, he was very skeptical of the SR announcement that the mine would be opening soon.
Well, the last stated public message out of that potential competitor is that they will be up and running mid-year. I hope that I will be invited to the grand opening. I haven't received the invitation yet. Or their ceremonial department is not doing a good job in organizing the party, or they're not going to be able to start up, which I believe is the case. But time will tell.
There are reports that Minnesota SR has hired investment and legal advisors to look at debt restructuring or other options for the struggling project. I'll be back in 2 minutes. Of all the months that come to call, could April be the cruelest of all? Obviously, it's the weather that caused me to wax poetic today. Another way to put it this morning is, if we recognize that disappointment is the norm, we will not be disappointed by the April storm. Okay, I have to stop this. The point is, I came into this April with high expectations. We'd been hearing about El Nino since early last year. Reports intensified as fall approached. Many weather experts were predicting one of the strongest El Ninos of all time. And then it began to happen as predicted. Heavy rainstorms in California, severe winter tornadoes in Texas, snow in the Southwest. And here, many could only dream of a white Christmas, as temperatures remained warm and above average through December. And as we watched Carl Bonak and the rest of the TV6 meteorologists through January and February, their reports continued to call for above normal temperatures and below normal snowfall. At one point, snowfall for the winter was running 4 feet below normal in Marquette. For a day or two in February, we had a teasing taste of what spring could bring. March also brought some warmer weather, and the snow on the ground began to disappear. Expectations for an early spring were high, at least mine were, when it arrived on March 20th. Warmer weather saw the snow continue to melt, and at one point in Marquette it was almost gone. And then April arrived, and with it, disappointment. In Marquette by April 10th, we had almost 40 inches of snow for the month. That's far more than we usually expect for the full month of April. However, it's not a record. In fact, it's nowhere near the record, which brings us back to my opening line. Of all the months that come to call, could April be the cruelest of all? I say that because, and some of you may even recall, in 2002, 83 inches of snow fell in April. 83 inches. That's almost 7 feet of snow. I can only imagine the disappointment for those waiting for spring that year. So where do we go from here? Spring-like weather finally arrived this week, and this should be the nicest weekend of the year so far. But there are still a couple of weeks to go, and who knows what that might bring. Let's hope it's not a return to 2002. All we can do is get our rakes and lawnmowers and garden tools set to go and hope for the best. But don't forget which of the months can be the cruelest of all. I'll be back in 2 minutes. About time to wrap it up for another week. I want to remind you that our show is available on the internet. You can find it at uppermichigansource.com. If you miss it, want to watch it again, or recommend it to someone else, it will be there, and usually available early on Monday afternoon. Previous episodes are already there. I want to thank Jim Weekly for joining us this morning. The Lake Carriers Association provide a critical link for this area's iron mining industry, so it's important to know what their concerns are going forward. The Today Show is coming up. Thanks for joining us today. I look forward to seeing you again next Sunday morning.